from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 42, Beelzebub in America. Reading 3. I think, my boy, that it will be very useful to you for your more detailed representation and understanding of the strangeness of the psyche in general of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy and who arise on the planet Earth, if I explain to you in somewhat greater detail the causes which, in the common presences of these American three-brained beings, produce disharmony in both of these fundamental functionings of theirs. For convenience of exposition, I shall explain to you separately the causes of the disharmony of each of these two fundamental functionings, and I shall begin with the explanation of the causes of the disharmony in the functioning of the transformation of their first being food, or as they themselves would say, with the causes of the spoiling of their stomachs. For the disharmony of this function of theirs, there were and now still are several definite causes, comprehensible even to the reason of ordinary, normal three-brained beings. But the chief and fundamental cause is that from the very beginning of the formation of their community, they gradually got accustomed, owing to all kinds of established surrounding conditions and influences proceeding from authority, which happened to be formed of itself abnormally, and they are now already thoroughly accustomed never to use for their first being food anything fresh whatsoever, but to use exclusively only products already decomposed. At the present time, the beings of this group almost never consume for their first being food any edible product which still retains all those active elements put into every being by great nature herself as an indispensable requisite for taking in power for normal existence, but they preserve, freeze, and essensify beforehand all those products of theirs and use them only when most of these active elements required for normal existence are already volatilized out of them. And this abnormality proceeded in the ordinary process of being existence of the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, in this instance, in the case of this new group, and continues to be spread and to be fixed everywhere there, also, of course, in consequence of the fact that, subsequent to the time when they, that is to say, when all the three-brained beings in general of that planet of yours had ceased to actualize in themselves the indispensable being efforts, there was then gradually destroyed in them the possibility for the crystallization in their common presences of those being data, thanks to which, even in the absence of the guidance of true knowledge, the maleficence for themselves of any of their manifestations can be sensed instinctively. In the present case, if only a few of these unfortunates possessed this instinct proper to three-brained beings, they might then, if only thanks merely to habitual, accidental being associations and confrontations, first themselves become aware, and afterwards inform all the rest, that as soon as the prime connection with common nature of any product in general serviceable as a first being food is severed, then no matter if this product be kept completely isolated, that is to say, hermetically sealed, frozen, or essensified, it must, like everything else in the universe, change its form and decompose according to the same principle and in the same order in which it was formed. Here you should know, concerning the active elements from which all cosmic formations are in general formed by nature, both those subject to transformation through the tetartocosmosis, and which are the product of the first food of beings, as well as in general all other completely spiritualized and half-spiritualized arisings, that as soon as the corresponding time arrives, these active elements, in whatever conditions they might be found, obligatorily begin separating in a certain order of succession from those masses in which they were fused during the trago-autoegocratic process. And the same, of course, proceeds with those products so dear to the American beings, which they preserve in what are called hermetically sealed cans. However, hermetically, these cans of products may be sealed as soon as the time of, so to say, disintegration arrives. The corresponding active elements infallibly begin to separate from the whole mass. And these active elements, thus separated from the whole mass, group themselves as a rule according to their origin in these hermetically sealed cans, in the form of drops or small bubbles, which, so to say, dissolve immediately when the cans are opened for the consumption of these products, and volatilizing into space, are dispersed to their corresponding places. The beings of this continent do sometimes consume fresh fruit, but as for these fruits of theirs, they cannot be said to be fruits, but simply and solely, as our dear teacher would say, freaks. By means of the trees existing in abundance on this continent, little by little, various scientists of new format have succeeded with their wiseacrings in making of these American fruits at the present time just, so to say, a feast for the eye, and not a form of being nourishment. The fruits there are now already so formed as to have within them scarcely anything of what was foreordained by great nature to be consumed for the normal being existence of beings. These scientists of new format there are of course very far from apprehending that when any supplanetary formation is artificially grafted or manipulated in any such fashion, it arrives in a state defined by objective science as absoismosa, in which it absorbs from its surrounding medium cosmic substances serviceable only for the coating of what is called its automatically self-reproducing subjective presence. The point is that from the very beginning of this latest contemporary civilization of theirs, it somehow so fell out among the beings of all the innumerable separate groups there, that of the 7 aspects of the fundamental commandment given to 3-brained beings from above, namely, strive to acquire inner and outer purity, the single aspect they selected and in a distorted form have made their ideal is that aspect which is conveyed in the following words: help everything around you, both the animate and the still inanimate, to acquire a beautiful appearance. And indeed, and especially in the last 2 centuries there, they have striven simply to attain a beautiful exterior, but of course only in regard to those various objects external to them themselves, which chanced in the given period to become, as they expressed it, fashionable. During this said period, it has been of no concern to them whether any object external to them themselves had any substance whatsoever. All that was necessary was that it should have what they call a striking appearance. As regards the achievements of the contemporary beings of this continent, in respect of actualizing the external beauty of these fruits of theirs, then indeed, my boy, I have nowhere seen, not only on the other continents of the same planet, but even on the other planets of that solar system, fruits so beautiful in appearance as those of the present time on this continent America. On the other hand, as regards the inner substance of these fruits, one can only use that favorite expression of our dear teacher, which consists of the following words: the greatest of all being blessings for man is the action of castor oil. And to what height they have carried their skill in making their famous preserves out of these fruits, as for this, as is said, neither tongue can tell nor pen describe. You have to see them for yourself to experience in your common presence the degree of the impulse of rapture to which one can be carried on perceiving with the organ of sight the external beauty of these American fruit preserves. Walking down the main streets of the cities of the beings of this continent, especially of the city New York, and seeing the display in any fruit store, it is hard to say at once just what it is the eyes behold. Is it an exhibition of pictures by the futurists of the city Berlin, of the continent Europe, or is it a display of the famous perfumery stores for foreigners of the world capital, that is, the city Paris? Only after a while, when you have finally managed to take in various details of the appearance of these displays, and somehow start reflecting again, can you clearly constate how much greater is the variety of color and shape of the jars in these American displays of fruit preserves than in the mentioned displays of the continent of Europe. And this is evidently due to the fact that in the common psyche of the beings of this new group, the combination resulting from the intermixture of former independent races happens to correspond more completely to a better perception and a thorough cognition of the sense and beneficence of the achievements of the reason both of the beings of the contemporary community of Germany in respect of the chemical substances they have invented, called there aniline and alizarine, as well as of the beings of the community France in respect of perfumery. I myself, when I first saw there such an exhibition, could not refrain from entering one of these stores and buying about 40 jars of all shapes, containing fruit preserves of every shade of color. I bought them to please the beings then accompanying me, and who came from the continents of Asia and Europe, where fruits so rarely beautiful to look at did not as yet exist. When I brought my purchases home and distributed them, these beings were at first indeed not a whit less astonished and delighted than I had been by their appearance. But afterwards, when they had consumed them for their first being food, all that was needed was to see their grimaces and the change of color on their faces to understand what effect these fruits in general have upon the organism of beings. The case is still worse on that continent, with that product which, for them as well as for almost all the three-brained beings of the universe, is the most important product for first being food, and namely, the product called prosphora, which they themselves name bread. Before I describe the fate of this American bread, I must tell you that this terra firma, part of the surface of your planet called North and South America, was formed thanks to various accidental combinations ensuing, in the first place, from the second great cataclysm, not according to law, which occurred to that ill-fated planet, and secondly, from the position that terra firma occupies in relation to the process of the common systematic movement, having a stratum of what is called soil, which was and still is suited for the production of that divine grain, of which this same prosphora is made. With conscious knowledge of how to use it, the soil surface of these continents is capable of yielding, in a single what is called good season, the fullness of a complete process of the sacred heptapara parshnuk, or in other words, a 49-fold harvest, and even by its semi-conscious use, as is not the case, the soil there yields of this divine grain a considerable abundance in comparison with the other continents. Well then, my boy, when the beings of that continent began to have, thanks to various fortuitous circumstances, many of those objects which, for this strange psyche of the contemporary three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, are a subject for their dreams and are everywhere called their dollars, thanks to which fact, according to long-established usage there, they acquired in their picturings of the beings of all the other continents what is called a sense of superiority, with the result, also now usual among them, that they began to wiseacre with everything to achieve that said contemporary ideal of theirs. Then they also began wiseacring with all their might with this divine grain out of which prospera is made. They began employing every possible means to, so to say, deform this divine grain in order to give to its product a beautiful and striking appearance. For this purpose, they invented a variety of machines by means of which they scrape, comb, smooth, and polish this wheat, which has the misfortune to arise on their continent, until they accomplish the complete destruction of all those active elements concentrated on the surface of the grains, just underneath what is called the husk, and precisely which are appointed by great nature for renewing in the common presences of beings what they have expended in worthily serving her. Hence it is, my boy, that the prospera, or bread, now produced there from this wheat, which arises in such abundance on this continent, contains nothing useful to the beings who consume it, and from its consumption there is produced in their presences nothing but noxious gases and what are called there worms. However, it must in all fairness be remarked that if they got for themselves from this wheat nothing that enables them to serve great nature better or more consciously, nevertheless, by producing in themselves the said worms, they do unconsciously very, very greatly assist their planet in honorable service to the most great common cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat. For are not these worms also beings through whom cosmic substances are also transformed? At any rate, the beings breeding on this continent have already achieved by these wiseacrings of theirs with this bread what they have greatly desired and striven to obtain, and namely, that the beings of all the other continents should never fail to say of them, as for instance, in the given case, something as follows: astonishingly smart fellows, these Americans. Even their bread is something extraordinary. So superb, so white, and simply charming. Really the splendor of splendors of contemporary civilization. But that from this deformity of wheat, their bread results in being worthless, and furthermore constitutes another of the innumerable factors in the spoiling of their stomachs. What is that to them? Are they not also in the front rank of contemporary, what is called European civilization? The most curious thing in all this naivety of theirs is that they give the best and most useful of what nature forms in this divine grain for their normal existence to the pigs, or simply burn it, while for themselves they consume that substance which is formed by nature in the wheat only for connecting and maintaining those active elements, which are localized chiefly, as I have already said, just under the husk of the grain. A second and also rather important factor in the disharmonizing of the digestive function of these unfortunate American three-brained beings is the system which they have recently invented for the elimination from themselves of the waste residue of their first food, and that is to say, the comfortable seats of what are called their water closets. In addition to the fact that this maleficent invention was and still is one of the chief factors in the said disharmonization now proceeding in them themselves, and also in almost all the beings of the other continents, who, by the way, have already begun in recent times very jealously imitating them in all their peculiar methods of assisting their transformatory functioning, your favorites, thanks to this invention of theirs, now striving to fulfill even this inevitable being function of theirs with the greatest possible sensation of pleasant tranquility, have got, as it were, a new incentive for the jealous service of their god self-calming, which, as I have already said more than once, has been and still is for them almost the chief evil, engendering and evoking all the abnormalities of their psyche, as well as of their ordinary being existence. A good example, and even so to say, an illuminatingly enlightening picture for your being representation of what extraordinary perspectives are opened for the future by just this invention of theirs, is the fact that already certain of these contemporary American beings, who have acquired, of course, also by a variety of accidents, a quantity of their famous dollars, now arrange in their water closets with comfortable seats such accessories as a small table, a telephone, and what is called a radio apparatus, so that when so sitting, they may continue their correspondence, discuss over the telephone with their acquaintances all their dollar businesses, quietly read the newspapers, which have become indispensable to them, or finally listen to those musical compositions, the work of various Hasnamuses there, which, because they are, as is said, fashionable, every contemporary American businessman is also obliged to know. The main harm in the significance of the resulting disharmony in the digestive functioning of all the contemporary three-brained beings of your planet from this American invention is due to the following causes. In former times, when more or less normal data for the engendering of objective reason were still crystallized in the common presences of your favorites, and they themselves could reflect and understand when other similar and already enlightened beings explain the subject to them, they made the said posture as was required. But subsequently, when the said being data had definitely ceased to crystallize in them, and they also began discharging this function of theirs only automatically, then, thanks to the system prevalent before this American invention, the planetary body could of itself, automatically, by virtue only of what is called animal instinct, adopt the required definite posture. But now that American beings have invented these comfortable seats, and they have all begun using them for this inevitable function of theirs, their planetary body can no longer possibly adapt itself, even instinctively, to the required posture, with the consequence that not only have certain what are called muscles, which actualize this inevitable being function, become gradually atrophied in those of your favorites who use these American comfortable seats, owing to which what are called obstructions are formed in them, but in addition the causes are engendered of several specifically new diseases, which in the whole of our great universe arise exclusively only in the presences of these strange three-brained beings. Among the various primary and secondary causes, the totality of which is gradually bringing about the disharmonization of this fundamental function in the common presences of your contemporary favorites breeding on that continent of North America, there is still another exceedingly peculiar cause which, although blatantly obvious among them, nevertheless, owing to their chicken reflections, flourishes with an impulse of egoistic satisfaction under, as it were, a cap of invisibility. This peculiar cause arose and also began slowly and quietly, but infallibly, disharmonizing this function in them, thanks simply to the fact that in the strange presences of the beings of this new large group, a ruling passion prevails, to be as often as possible on the continent of Europe. You should also be informed about this peculiar cause, chiefly because you will learn from it of yet another result, harmful for all your favorites, of the evil wiseacrings of their contemporary scientists. For your better representation and understanding of this cause of the gradual disharmonizing of this inevitable being function in the common presences of the American beings, you should first be familiar with a certain detail of just those organs which actualize the said function in their common presences. Among their organs for the complete transformation of the first food is one that exists almost everywhere under the name of tuspushok, or, as they themselves call it, a blind process, and in their scientific terminology, appendix. The action of this organ, as appointed by great nature, is that various connective cosmic substances, separated by the transformation of the various surplanetary crystallizations which compose the first being food, are gathered in it in the form of what are called gases, in order that later, at the time of the elimination from the common presences of the beings of the already waste residue of the said food, these gases should by this pressure assist this act. The gases gathered in this organ actualize by their, so to say, discharge, the mechanical action designed by nature, independently of the general transformatory functioning proceeding in the beings, and only at definite periods of time established in each being differently according to subjective habit. Well then, my boy, thanks to their frequent trips to the continent Europe, the round trip taking from 12 days to a month, conditions are created for a daily change of time for the fulfillment of this established function, with the consequence that a serious factor results for the gradual engendering of disharmony in the process of their common fundamental transformatory functioning. That is to say, when for a period of many days, on account of the change of the established time, they fail to perform this indispensable function of theirs, and the gases thus collected in this organ, not being utilized by them for the automatic action of the purpose indicated, and not fulfilling the design preconceived by great nature, gradually escaping from their presences unproductively into space, the totality of these manifestations of theirs, by the way, making existence on these passenger ships of theirs almost intolerable for a being with a normally developed organ for perceiving odors. Then, as a result of all this, there often occurs in them what is called a mechanical obstruction, which in its turn also conduces to the said gradual disharmonization of this fundamental transformatory function of theirs. When I began to explain to you, my boy, the causes of the disharmony in the presences of these American beings, of the function of the transformation of the first being food, and when I mentioned the comfortable seats invented by them, I said, among other things, that these strange three-brained beings who have taken your fancy and who breed on the planet Earth were again striving to perform even this indispensable being function of theirs with the greatest possible sensation of self-satisfaction for themselves. I said again because previously, in various periods of the flow of time, these strange three-brained beings there, who have taken your fancy, had already several times introduced something similar into the usages of their ordinary existence. I remember very clearly one of those periods when the beings of that time, who, by the way, according to the notions of your contemporary favorites, were nothing but ancient savages, invented every possible kind of convenience for performing this same, although prosaic, yet indispensable being need, on account of which these contemporary Americans, who in their naivete consider themselves already civilized to the ne plus ultra, have invented these comfortable seats in their water closets. This was precisely during the period when the chief center of culture for the whole of your planet was the country Tikliamish, and when this country was experiencing the height of its splendor. For this being function, the beings of the country Tikliamish invented something rather like these American comfortable seats, and this maleficent invention also spread widely everywhere among all the other beings of that ill-fated planet. If the said invention of the beings of the Tikliamishian civilization were compared with the invention of these contemporary Americans, then, according to the expression they sometimes use for comparison, the latter may be called a child's toy. The beings of the XLII civilization invented a certain kind of comfortable couch bed, which could be used for sleeping as well as for what is called lounging, so that while lying on this wonderful contrivance, and without manifesting the slightest being effort whatsoever, they could perform the same inevitable being need, for which the contemporary beings of the continent America have invented their seats of ease. These wonder beds were so adapted for this purpose that a lever by the side of the bed had only to be touched lightly to enable one instantly, in the bed itself, to perform this same indispensable need, freely and of course very cosily, and also with the greatest, so to say, chic. It will not be superfluous, my boy, for you to know also, by the way, that these same famous beds had the effect of causing great and momentous events in the process of their ordinary existence. So long as the previous relatively normal system still prevailed among the beings there, for the said being functions, everything went along very peacefully and quietly, but as soon as certain what are called power-possessing and wealth-possessing beings of that time had invented for this purpose the mentioned comfortable beds, which came to be called, if you wish to enjoy felicity, then enjoy it with a bang. There, then, began among the ordinary beings of that time that which led to the said serious and deplorable consequences. I must tell you that it was just during those years when the beings of XLII were inventing these wonder beds that this planet of yours underwent a common cosmic process of cirnua novo. That is to say, that concomitantly with the displacement of the gravity's center movement of this solar system in the movement of the common cosmic harmony, the center of gravity of this planet itself was also displaced. During such years, as you already know, thanks to this cosmic manifestation, there increases everywhere on planets, in the psyche of the beings inhabiting any planet undergoing cirnua novo, a blago-neurarian sensation, or, as it is otherwise called, remorse of conscience for one's past deeds against one's own convictions. But there on your planet, thanks to the common presences of your favorites having become so odd, from a variety of causes both proceeding from outside of them and arising through their own fault, the result of the action of this common cosmic actualization does not proceed in them as it proceeds in the presences of the three-brained beings arising on other planets during cirnua novo. That is to say, instead of this remorse of conscience, there usually arise there and become widespread certain specific processes called the reciprocal destruction of microcosmoses in the tetartocosmos, which processes, when proceeding in them, they themselves look upon as what are called among them epidemics, and which in ancient times were known by the names Kalunum, Morkrok, Selnuano, etc., and in present days by the names Black Death, Cholera, Spanish Influenza, and so on. Well then, thanks to the fact that many of these diseases, then called Kolbana, Tirdiank, Moyasul, Champarnak, and so on, and called by contemporary beings Tabes, Sclerosis disseminata, hemorrhoids, ischias, hemiplegia, and so on, were widely prevalent among the majority of those using these exceedingly comfortable couch beds, those beings from among them in whose common presences the data for Hasnamusian properties had, thanks to the complete absence of the actualization of being part dog duty, already previously begun to be crystallized more intensively than usual, and among whom were those called revolutionaries, observing this particularity, decided to take advantage of it for their own purposes. That is to say, types of this kind invented and circulated, broadcast among the masses of beings of that time, that all the aforesaid epidemic, contagious diseases resulted from the fact that, thanks to the beds, if you wish to enjoy felicity, then enjoy it with a mighty bang. The parasitic bourgeois contracted various diseases, which diseases afterwards spread by contagion among the masses. Thanks to that peculiar inherency of theirs called suggestibility, which I mentioned before, and which had been acquired in their common presences, all the surrounding beings, of course, believe this, as they call it, propaganda of theirs, and there usually being, in these cases, a quantity of talk about it, there was gradually crystallized in each of them the periodically arising factor which actualizes in their common presences that strange and relatively prolonged psychic state, which I should call the loss of sensation of self, in consequence of which, as also usually happens there, they set about destroying everywhere, not only these wonder beds, but also the existence of those beings who used them. Although the acute stage of this, so to say, obtuseness in the presences of most of the ordinary beings of that period soon passed, nevertheless, the raging destruction, both of these beds themselves and of the beings who used them, continued by momentum during several terrestrial years. Eventually, this maleficent invention went completely out of use, and soon it was even forgotten that such beds had ever existed on the planet. At any rate, it can be said with certainty that if the civilization of the beings of the group now breeding on the continent America develops in its present spirit and at its present rate, then they also will unquestionably civilize themselves to the degree of having bed couches, as astonishing as were those beds, if you wish to enjoy felicity. Then enjoy it with a bang. It will not be amiss now, my boy, also to remark, by way of illustration, upon the invention of preserved products for the first being food and their application in the process of being existence by the beings of this contemporary group, who in recent times have chanced to become, for the strange reason of the beings of all the other continents, so to say, objects of imitation, chiefly on account simply of the fact that they were supposed to be the first on their planet to invent such beneficent and convenient being usages, namely, in the given case, the device of feeding themselves with preserved products, thanks to which they, as it were, save time. The contemporary unfortunate three-brained beings in general who breed on your planet are, of course, not aware, nor, for causes already explained to you, have they in themselves the possibility of reflecting that their remote ancestors of various past ages, who were much more normally formed into responsible beings, must have racked their brains, as is said, not a little, to discover means for minimizing the time spent on this inevitable being necessity of feeding themselves with products. And having found such apparently expedient methods, they, every time after a brief trial of them, eventually became convinced that these products, of whatever kind and however they might be preserved, always deteriorated with time and became worthless for their first food, and hence they ceased to employ these methods in the process of their ordinary existence. As a parallel to this contemporary means of preserving products for one's first being food in hermetically sealed vessels, let us take as an example that means of preserving which I personally have witnessed in the country Maroplasi. It was just at the time when the beings of the locality of Maroplasi were vying in everything with the beings of the country Tikliamish, and were engaged in a fierce rivalry with them, that the beings of all other countries should consider their country the first and foremost center of culture. Just then it was that they invented, among other things, something similar to these American preserves. Those beings of Maroplasi, however, preserved their edible products, sealed hermetically, not in poison-exuding tin cans, such as the contemporary beings of the continent America use, but in what were then called Sikarinenian vessels. These Sikh-Renanian vessels in Maro-Plessis were prepared from very finely ground, what are called there mother of pearl, yolks of hen's eggs, and a glue obtained from the fish named the Chusna sturgeon. These vessels had the appearance and quality of the unpolished glass jars now existing there on your planet. In spite of all the obvious advantages of preserving products in such vessels, yet nevertheless, when certain beings, with reason, in the country Maro-Plessis, constated that in those beings who habitually used products preserved in this way, there was gradually atrophied what is called organic shame. Then, having succeeded in widely spreading among the other ordinary beings information about this constation of theirs, all the other surrounding beings, similar to them, gradually ceased to employ this method, and eventually it was so completely dropped from common use that even the knowledge that such a method had ever existed failed even to reach the 5th or 6th generation after them. On this continent, Asia, there have existed throughout almost all the ages all kinds of methods for preserving edible products for a long time, and even now several of these methods exist there which have come down to the contemporary beings from their very remote ancestors. But of all these methods, not one was so harmful for the beings themselves as this method invented by these contemporary beings of the continent America, namely, the preserving of products in poison-exuding tin cans. Even this device for preserving products hermetically sealed, so that without being exposed to the effects of the atmosphere, they should, as it were, escape the process of decomposition, exists among certain contemporary Asiatic groups, but they do not all have recourse for this purpose to the aid of these poison-exuding American tin cans. At the present time on the continent Asia, only what is called sheep's tail fat is used for this purpose. Sheep's tail fat is a product which is formed in a large quantity around the tail of a certain form of two-brained quadruped being named there sheep, breeding everywhere on the continent Asia. In this sheep's tail fat, there are no cosmic crystallizations harmful for the common presence of a three-brained being, and it is itself one of the chief products for the first food of the majority of the beings of these general groups on the continent Asia. But as regards the metal from which these contemporary beings of the continent America prepare cans for the preservation of their products, however completely they may be isolated on the inside from the influence of the atmosphere, they also, after a definite time, like the contents of the cans, give off from themselves various of their active elements, some of which are very, as they express it, poisonous for the common presences of beings in general. These poisonous active elements, which issue from tin or similar metal, remaining in hermetically closed cans, are unable to volatilize into space, and in time, meeting among the elements of the products within these cans, certain elements which correspond to them by what is called kinship of class, by number of vibrations, fuse with them according to the cosmic law named fusion, and remain in them, and together with these products, of course, afterwards enter into the common organism of the beings who consume them. Besides preserving their products in these poison-exuding tin cans so harmful for them, your contemporary favorites grouped on this continent, America, furthermore preserve them preferably in raw states. The beings of the continent Asia always preserve all their food products roasted or boiled, because according to this custom, which reached them from their remote ancestors, products preserved in this way do not decompose so rapidly as when raw. The explanation is that when a product is boiled or roasted, there is induced an artificial what is called chemical fusion of the several active elements of which the fundamental mass of the given product consists, thanks to which fusion, many active elements useful for beings remain in the products for a comparatively much longer time. I again advise you to become thoroughly and particularly well acquainted with all the kinds of fusion proceeding in the megalocosmos, with the chemical as well as with the mechanical. Knowledge of this cosmic law will greatly help you, by the way, to represent to yourself and well understand why and how these numerous and varied formations are in general produced in nature, and how what is called a permanent fusion of elements is obtained in products from boiling or roasting. You will clearly understand if, upon reflection, you grasp merely the process which occurs during the artificial preparation of prosphora. Prosphora, or bread, is in general made everywhere by beings who are aware of its sacred significance. Only your contemporary favorites regard its preparation without any consciousness of its effect, but merely as a practice automatically transmitted to them by inheritance. In this bread, the crystallization of cosmic substances is also obtained according to the law of Triamazikamno. The substances from the following three relatively independent sources, serving as the three holy forces of this sacred law, namely, the wholly affirming, or active principle, is the totality of those cosmic substances composing what your favorites call water. The denying, or passive principle, is the totality of the substances composing what your favorites call the flour, obtained from the divine wheat grain. And the wholly reconciling, or neutralizing principle, is the substance issuing or obtained as the result of burning, or as your favorites say, from fire. For a better elucidation of the thought I have expressed concerning the significance of a permanent fusion of diverse sourced cosmic substances, let us take as an example the said relatively independent totality of substances which, in the formation of this prosphora, or bread, is the active principle, namely the relatively independent totality which is called by your favorites water. This relatively independent totality of cosmic substances, named there on the earth water, being in itself, one might say, a natural mechanical mixture, can be preserved exclusively only in conditions of conjunction with common nature. If the connection of this water with common nature is cut, that is to say, if a little of this water is taken out of a river and kept separately in a vessel, then after a certain time the water in this vessel inevitably begins to be gradually destroyed, or as it might otherwise be said, to decompose. And this process, to the perceptive organs of beings, usually smells very malodorously, or as your favorites would say, this water soon stinks. And the same will proceed with the mixture, as in the given case of this said water and flour. Only a temporary mechanical mixture, or what is called dough, will be obtained, in which this water, after lasting also a relatively short time, will inevitably begin to decompose. Further, if this dough, that is, water mixed with flour, is baked over a fire, then, thanks to substances issuing from or formed from this fire, substances which, in the given case, as I have already said, serve as the third holy neutralizing force of the sacred law of Triamazikamno, there will result, in the given case, a chemical fusion, that is, a permanent fusion of substances, as a result of which the new totality of substances obtained from this water and the flour, namely the prosphora, or bread, will now resist the merciless Herapus. That is to say, it will not decompose for a much longer time. The bread made in this way can dry, crumble, or even be to all appearances gradually completely destroyed, yet from this process of transformation the elements of the water will, during the said fairly long time, be no further destroyed, but will remain active, for the said time, among what are called the enduring Prosphorian active elements. And in the given case, my boy, I again repeat that if the contemporary beings breeding on the continent of Asia preserve their products exclusively only in a roasted or boiled state, and not when raw, as the contemporary American beings prefer to do, this also occurs there in consequence of the fact that these usages reached the beings of Asia from their ancestors, the term of whose communities was many centuries, and who in consequence had a long practical experience, whereas the term of the community of those American beings is still, as our wise teacher would say, only a day and a half. In order that you may better evaluate the significance of this invention of those contemporary beings breeding on the continent America, and which is, as it were, the real outcome of contemporary civilization, I do not consider it superfluous to inform you also of the methods of preserving several other products for a long time, which methods are now in use among the beings of the continent Asia. Such, for instance, is the method of preparing what is called shawarma, a particularly favorite product of the beings of many groups of the continent Asia. This shawarma on the continent Asia is prepared in a very simple manner, namely, small pieces of well-roasted meat are tightly packed into earthenware jars, or goatskin borduks. A borduk is the skin stripped in a special manner from the being called goat. Melted sheep's tail fat is then poured over these roasted pieces of meat. Although the pieces of roasted meat, thus covered with fat, do also gradually deteriorate with time, yet over a relatively very long time they do not acquire in themselves any poison. The beings of the continent Asia use this shawarma either cold or heated up. In the latter case, it is as if the meat were freshly killed. Another very favorite product there, preservable for a long time, is what is called yagliemish, which consists of nothing else than various fruits. For this purpose, fruits freshly gathered from the tree are immediately strung on a cord in the form of what is called a necklace, and then thoroughly boiled in water. When these odd necklaces are cooled, they also are dipped several times in melted sheep's tail fat, and after all this they are hung up somewhere, where they are exposed to the effects of a current of air. However long fruit prepared in this way may hang, it scarcely ever spoils, and when these odd necklaces are to be used for food, they are put into hot water for a little, whereupon all the fat on them being heated entirely disappears, and the fruit itself is as if it had been freshly picked from the tree. Even though fruit preserved in this manner differs very little in taste from fresh fruit, and will keep a very long time, nevertheless, all the well-to-do beings of the continent Asia prefer fresh fruit. And this is obviously because in most of them, as direct descendants of the beings of long-existing ancient communities, thanks to the possibilities which have reached them by inheritance, the crystallizing of data for the instinctive sensing of reality proceeds much more intensively in them than in most of your other contemporary favorites. I repeat, my boy, that there on your planet the beings of past epochs, especially those breeding on this continent of Asia, had already many times attempted to use various methods of preserving products for a long time, and it always ended as follows. First of all, certain persons, thanks to their conscious or accidental observations, discovered the undesirable and harmful consequences of this kind of practice, both for themselves and for those near them, and then they communicated this to all the other beings, who, having also made observations, with as much impartiality as possible towards themselves, also became convinced of the correctness of these deductions, and ultimately they all ceased to employ these practices in the process of their existence. Even quite recently, in this same continent, Asia, certain beings again attempted not only to find a method by which it might indeed be possible to preserve their edible products for a long time, without deterioration, but they even tried to find some entirely new means for minimizing as much as possible the time spent on this inevitable being need of feeding on the first food. And this time they were almost on the verge of discovering a very suitable method for this purpose. I can give you satisfactory details concerning the interesting results of their new investigations in this sphere, because I not only personally knew the terrestrial three-brained being, who by his conscious labors discovered the said method, but was even present personally at several elucidatory experiments upon the possibilities of applying this method to beings, conducted by the initiator himself of the, so to say, new investigations. His name was Asiman, and he was a member of a group of contemporary Asiatic three-brained beings, who, having cognized their slavish dependence upon certain causes within themselves, organized a collective existence for the purpose of working upon themselves, to deliver themselves from this inner slavery. It is interesting to notice that this group of contemporary terrestrial three-brained beings, one of whom was this brother Asiman, had previously existed in the country formerly Pearland, now called Hindustan. But afterwards, when beings from the continent of Europe appeared there and began disturbing them and hindering their peaceful work, they all migrated across what are now called there the Himalayan mountains and settled partly in the country Tibet and partly in what are called the valleys of the Hindu Kush. Brother Asiman was one of those who settled in the valleys of the Hindu Kush. As time was precious to the members of this brotherhood, who were working for their self-perfection, and the process of eating robbed them of a great deal of time, this brother Asiman, being very well versed in the science then called alchemy, began working very earnestly in the hope of finding what is called a chemical preparation, on the introduction of which into himself a being could exist without spending so much time in the preparation and consumption of all kinds of products for his first food. After long and intensive work, Brother Asiman found for this purpose a combination of chemical substances in the form of a powder, one small thimbleful of which, introduced into a being once in every 24 hours, made it possible for him both to exist without consuming anything else except water as food, and to perform all his being obligations without injury. When I chanced to visit this monastery where Brother Asiman existed with the other brethren of the said small group of your contemporary favorites, this preparation had already been used by all the brethren for 5 months, and Brother Asiman, with the participation of others of the brethren, who were also very familiar with this question, was intensively busy with elucidatory experiments on a large scale. And these same experiments showed them that this preparation could not ultimately suffice for normal being existence. After this constatation of theirs, they not only entirely ceased the use of this preparation, but even destroyed the very formula for preparing it, which Brother Asiman had found. Several months later, I again happened to come upon that monastery and acquainted myself personally with the document of these brethren, which had been composed by them on the day when they finally seized the use of this indeed astonishing preparation. This document contained, among other things, several very interesting details about the action of this said preparation of Asiman. It was stated that when this preparation was introduced into the presence of a being, it had, besides its nourishing property, a particular action upon what are called the wandering nerves of the stomach, from which action not only did the need for food immediately cease in beings, but furthermore every desire to introduce into oneself any other edible product whatsoever entirely disappeared, and if something should be forcibly introduced, it took a long time before the disagreeable sensation and state thus provoked would pass. It was also stated that at the outset no change was noticed in the presence of beings who fed on this preparation. Even their weight did not diminish. Only after 5 months did its harmful effect begin to be evident in the common presence of a being, in the gradual weakened functioning of certain perceptive organs, and of the manifestations of their, so to say, ableness and sensitiveness. For example, their voices would grow weaker, and their sight, hearing, and so on worse. Furthermore, in several of them, from the beginning of the derangement of these being functions, changes were observed in their common psychic state. In the document composed by these brethren, there was, among other things, a lengthy description of the changes in the character of beings after 5 months' use of this remarkable preparation of Asiman, and in illustration some very excellent and apt comparisons were given. Although the examples themselves, which were given for comparison in this document, have not remained in my memory, yet thanks to the so to say flavor of them, which I have retained, I shall be able to give you their purport, if I use the language of our respected Mullah Nasr ad-Din. For example, an ordinary good fellow, with the character of, as they say, one of God's angels, suddenly became as irritable as those of whom our dear Mullah Nasr ad-Din once said, "He is as irritable as a man who has just undergone full treatment by a famous European nerve specialist." Or again, beings who one day had been as pacific as the little butter lambs which the pious place on the festal table at their most important religious feasts, would on the next day get as exasperated as a German professor when some Frenchman, also a professor, discovers something new in contemporary science. Or again, a being whose love resembled that of a contemporary terrestrial suitor for a rich widow, of course, before he has received a single penny from her, would turn just as spiteful as one of those malicious persons who, foaming at the mouth, will hate that poor author who is now writing about you and me in his work entitled An Objectively Impartial Criticism of the Life of Man. This poor upstart author, by the way, will be hated both by the full-bodied materialists and by the 96-carat deists, and even by those of the 3-brained beings who have taken your fancy, who, when their stomachs are full and their mistresses are for the moment making no scenes, are incorrigible optimists, but who, quite the contrary, when their stomachs are empty, are hopeless pessimists. Now, my boy, that we have mentioned this queer upstart writer, there is nothing for it but to inform you here of a certain perplexity which already long ago arose in me in regard to him, and which has progressively increased, and that is concerning a naivety of his.